A big thank you to all my patrons who support the Engineered Mind podcast. Hi and welcome to the Engineered Mind podcast. In this podcast we cover topics such as engineering, artificial intelligence, neuroscience and other interesting topics to educate, inspire and engineer people's minds all around the world. I'm your host Jousef, and for this episode of the podcast I'm very excited to welcome Caglar Cakan to my show. Caglar is a physicist and computational neuroscientist working in the Neural Information Processing Group in the Technical University of Berlin. This group is concerned with the principles underlying information processing in biological systems. Caglar has a wide variety of interests, reaching from the interpretation of quantum mechanics. He's also interested in cosmology, programming, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized systems. In this really interesting podcast, Caglar and I talked about his recent paper on a deep sleep model of the human brain, why we simulate brain patches rather than single neurons, how we can use thermodynamics to solve the brain, how Caglar transitioned from industry back to academia, the most fascinating ideas in AI and neuroscience, and much more interesting aspects of Caglar's research. For updates on upcoming podcasts, projects and videos, make sure to follow me on Twitter as well as on Instagram. To join my weekly newsletter engineeredmind.sh, where I share exclusive content, visit jousef.substack.com. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's my podcast with Caglar Cakan. So hi Caglar, welcome to my podcast. We have today a physicist and a computational neuroscientist on the show. So welcome first of all.
Thanks for having me.
As always, what we want to start with is, can you give us like a 1 minute crisp and quick bio of who Caglar is and what he does?
So who am I? I'm a physicist by training. I've been studying physics and philosophy actually in university, and I did my master's in general relativity, so completely unrelated to what I'm doing right now. But I was always close to theoretical physics and theory. And for a couple of years, I've been doing a PhD in the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin. And since then, I'm a big fan of computational neuroscience. I've learned a lot. And if I'm not doing that, I'm programming a lot. I'm programming generative art stuff. I really like music and among other things. So yeah, keep myself busy with that.
Mm-hmm. Sounds super exciting. You being a physicist, you always, or you also worked on a sleep model in your recent paper, which I saw. I had a quick look at it, where you also had dynamical systems being involved. Could you maybe briefly talk about this paper and what it was about, because it's super exciting?
So this paper, the whole project that we've been doing is in the context of so-called whole brain modeling. And whole brain modeling is as crazy as it sounds. Basically, you're trying to model a whole human brain. And there's multiple steps involved in how you can do that, how you approach that problem. Obviously, you start with a scan of a human brain. So you put people into a scanner, you take 3D photographs of their brain, you could say, so in the MRI, and you rebuild a network model of their brain, which is basically something like a map showing you which brain region is connected to which other brain region. And it's also very interesting how to do that. I can go into detail in a little bit, but let's say now you rebuild a network model of the brain consisting of brain regions. Now, in the next step, then you take your dynamical system. And a dynamical system is a mathematical model that uses equations to simulate some kind of behavior that you're interested in. And in our case, we use so-called neural population models, or also called mean field models. These models are there to describe the macroscopic dynamics of a whole bunch of neurons. So what I'm trying to say here is that you have a model that describes a patch of neurons, and that patch then can represent a brain area. So you have your brain network, you have your model describing a bunch of neurons. Now you combine the two, and what you get is a network model of interconnected brain areas, which is the whole brain, at least the cortex of it, which is majority of the brain. So that brain model, it can do various things. It can, it can oscillate. It has activity. The activity can be transmitted from brain area to another, etc. And they have been used in the past to build simulations of the brain in a so-called resting state, which is basically, I mean, in a physicist language, you would say it's something like the ground state of the brain. So it's what your brain does when you don't do any specific task. So when you lie down in the scanner and someone tells you to not think about anything too specific and not engage in any task, you will still have some kind of correlations and patterns in your brain activity. And that we call resting state. So these models have been very successful in reproducing resting state. And what we have done now is to use these methods to try to represent a completely different brain state, which is the brain during deep sleep. And during deep sleep, the brain does something completely weird, in my opinion, which is it starts to oscillate very, very slowly. So it's so-called slow wave sleep. And in slow wave sleep, you have up states and down states, so activity and no activity. And when you look at the brain during slow wave sleep, you can see waves with a frequency of even lower than 1 hertz, just traveling across your cortex. When you go sleep, you go into deep sleep, you will see activity going like whoa, whoa, whoa across your cortex. And this is super interesting activity. It is very important for memory consolidation, especially. Without sleep, you die out of multiple reasons, but you also lose your memory. And we know that this specific slow activity is very important to gain memory. And very briefly said, the brain in that state, the main task that people know of, what the brain does, is to clean itself somehow, metabolically, but at the same time also transfer memory from short-term memory into long-term memory. So that's basically where your brain decides what to remember forever and what information during the day that you accumulated to throw away.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. I can listen to you for like hours when you talk about that. It's so cool. You talked about these patches that you model. Why is it that you simulate patches and not single neurons?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I was hoping that you would ask that. So maybe let's go one step back, is that maybe your listeners are more aware of artificial neurons, artificial neural networks in AI, what you usually do. And these are typically, artificial neural networks. You use some kind of a transfer function, tanh function, for example. That tanh function is your neuron in an AI setting. And what it does is inputs to outputs, but transformed with this tanh function. So this is basically just a mathematical transformation. In computation, in neuroscience, when we have a model of a neuron, we also call it neuron. It represents a neuron, but we call them biological neural networks, as opposed to artificial neural networks. Of course, they're also artificial. They're mathematical simulations. But these biological neural networks, they have very simple property. If they're point neurons, so they have no extension, they have no 3D structure, they're just a point in space. You can think of it like that. And it integrates inputs. So spikes come, and then the membrane potential of one neuron, when spikes come in, just rises up to a threshold. And if your neuron reaches that threshold, it fires itself and transmits those spikes into other neurons. And so a very basic way to model this equation is using this phenomenon is using point neural networks, for example, integrate and fire neuron, we call them. Integrate and fire means integrate and fire. And you can represent this using one equation or two equations. I mean, if you get fancy, you can get a second equation, so to speak. But even one equation, so it's a very, very simple way of describing a neuron, and it's surprisingly good. So if you compare a real neuron, you take it out of a brain, and then you take your model computer neuron, and you give them both the same input. The computer neuron gets simulated input. The real neuron from, let's say, a human brain gets, or a rat brain, gets some kind of input that you simulate with electronics. And they behave very, very similarly. So that gives us kind of a confidence that these point neural networks consisting of a single equation or two are very good in reproducing the spiking activity. So one equation. So, but the thing is, now in neuroscience, you usually look at neural systems, a whole bunch of neurons. One neuron doesn't do anything exciting. So you usually combine tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of neurons, and in the whole brain, it's just 10 to the power of, I guess, 15 or so. It's a very, very high number of neurons that you would have to simulate in order to capture the full dynamics. Obviously, that is completely impossible with the computers of today. I mean, my laptop will start to tumble when I try to simulate, like, let's say 10,000 neurons, right? But that's where the magic starts to happen. And you get dynamics that only a population can do and not a single neuron. So that was all the precursor of what I'm trying to say here now. Because now what we, in computational neuroscience, people have come up with this beautiful formalism, and it's learned directly from statistical physics, which is so-called mean field theory. And that enables you to simulate a patch of neurons that has, in theory, n to infinity neurons. So what you do is the following. Or let's say, I want to describe it with an analogy. If you're interested in the macroscopic behavior of a neural system, so only the firing of the average firing of neurons inside this patch, but not in which neuron is spiking at which time exactly. If you're not interested in this detailed information, you can try to simplify the system to give you some macroscopic information, like what's the mean membrane potential right now, for example. And the way you do this is the following. Imagine you look at gas. In physics, if you're interested in a gas, and you usually, when you describe a gas, you usually describe it in terms of macroscopic variables, right? You say it's a certain temperature, it has pressure, it has volume, etc. So these kind of things. Describe things that that describe the whole population of particles. The way you compute, let's say, a pressure of a gas is not by looking at which atom is at what point, at which time exactly to compute a pressure. But it turns out that it is enough to describe the whole gas by only describing one single particle. Because if every particle is the same, if every particle is interchangeable with any other particle, it's a gas, homogeneous gas, then it's enough to just describe one single particle in its environment of other particles, right? That's where the name mean field comes from. It basically describes the mean field of interactions that one single particle is subject to. Now, the craziest thing about this is that you can use this formalism with neural networks. So what you do is you assume you have infinitely many neurons being in a network of random connections, so randomly connected neurons. And again, you can say that it is enough to describe just one single neuron in order to know what all the neurons are doing, because they're similar to each other. So you do that, you take one neuron, you describe its environment, you say it receives on average this and that many inputs and spikes from other neurons, and then you go with n to infinity, and what you end up with is a mathematical model describing an n to infinity neurons. So that's your model of a neural population.
That means that you basically take approaches from thermodynamics instead of solving like a huge system of equations, which is like incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. You can also call it like dimensionality reduction, or reduction of complexity in a way. And that's what thermodynamics also is trying to do, right? With
Yeah. How big is the patch? Is it like a hyperparameter that you choose? Hyperparameter, of course, in quote unquote. Or how do you choose this patch size?
There are several theoretical quirks about this. So first of all, in order to have it mathematically rigorous, you need to go with n to infinity. Otherwise, you just have effects just from the sheer fact that you're not infinitely big. You will have effects, so-called finite size effects. But the size of the patch, anyway, although it's not mathematically defined, so it has no size in the formalism, at least in most of the formalisms that I know. However, you can say that since the scaling laws, so let's say a cubic centimeter of cortex behaves in a certain way, and if 2 cubic centimeters of cortex behave in a similar way, then this model could be used to describe both, basically. But you, once you start putting these systems together, once you start connecting them up, then you start getting, you need more information about the system, right? How are these two cubes of cortex connected to each other? Then you start counting cables between cubes, basically trying to figure out how strongly they are connected. And then the properties of the system can change, obviously, because your network of neural systems can look differently.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Cool. This is so interesting. Maybe we'll get back to that at a later point. I also know that you used to work as a machine learning engineer in the industry, but came back to academia because of intrinsic motivation, or what was the plan?
An interaction of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, I would say. So I finished my physics degree, and I watched lectures online, actually, from MIT about machine learning. That's how I became a machine learning data scientist, and which is beautiful to see that is possible, right? So I'm not trying to praise my abilities here. It's just something that everyone can do. I'm sure about this. So you can teach yourself to be professional in these fields even. So that's amazing. And I worked for a year in a company. I'm not going to go into details what this company was doing because it's not interesting, but they were basically trying to transition from their old model into a AI-powered model, which many companies are trying to do. And at the end of the day, I was building machine learning models to sell more stuff to people, which is, I guess, 80-90% of all the jobs out there. And that is just boring. It is not something that I want to spend my time doing, especially if I'm not really, backing this product myself. And so I thought this is just temporary. And then, back then I was still looking for options to do theoretical physics, maybe a PhD in theoretical physics. But during that time, I learned about computational neuroscience. And I have to admit, I also learned about its existence because I didn't know that this whole field was existing when I was working. So I just quit and I started a PhD, and it was the best decision I've done so far, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I think we can feel it because the way how you explain things, it's in a very enthusiastic way. So I really appreciate that, Caglar. What for you is like the most promising idea if it's in neuroscience or AI? Maybe let's tackle neuroscience first. What idea is, like, when you heard about that idea, you were like, oh, this is crazy?
So maybe just, the very, very basic thing that you can use mathematics to understand the brain itself is, to me, crazy, very crazy, because you have the certain feeling as a person who is inclined with natural sciences that biology itself is not enough to understand what the brain does. You need something like computer science, something like information theory, something like that to understand what this thing is doing. And just that's true. I'm very convinced of that, and that the whole neuroscience, computational neuroscience business builds on this assumption that is true. That is crazy. In terms of what we have learned about the brain, so zooming out a little bit, it just amazes me how many different phenomena we're starting to understand. So it's really not a black box anymore that we have between our ears. We have several models for detection on whether a sound cue comes from left or right of your brain, how memory can be implemented in the brain, like how can neurons remember information, how does the visual system work, how do neurons see different angles in your visual field, etc. So all these things that also look very crazy, there are models now that are convincing models sometimes, even, that you can say we're starting to understand. And then zooming one step more back, I would say where it gets really interesting is where you have real world effects using this kind of science, which might be the treatment of diseases or changing the brain in some kind of way that you enhance the brain, for example. I'm working in the field of whole brain simulations, and the whole context, as I was trying to say very quickly before, is in sleep we have memory consolidation. And why we are particularly interested in this is, first of all, to understand the mechanism. That's interesting for itself. But second of all, I was telling you that you have these slow oscillations going through your brain, and they are important for your brain to know what to remember, what not. It turns out that when you stimulate your brain with an electrical current, so what you do is you take electrodes, you put one here and one here, and you pump very, very weak current. So it's not this electroshock thingy that many people think of. It's very weak. So you don't even feel it. You sleep while this experiment is done. So when you go into slow wave sleep, you turn on a sinusoidal current just flowing through your brain, and this entrains. It amplifies these oscillations that I was talking about. It makes them stronger. And it turns out that if you do that, and you compare now a bunch of people that learn something during the day, and they go to sleep in a sleeping laboratory, and then a second group of people that learn the same thing, but they go to sleep, and in the sleeping laboratory, you stimulate them during night. You amplify this process I was talking about. Turns out they remember it better than the first group. You can now, so we're starting to go into a direction where we're not only concerned about treating a malfunction of the brain anymore, which is, it's a very good reason for itself. But since we're slowly understanding these processes, we can even ask, how can we improve it? How can we help people that may not need help by themselves or may not suffer from anything,
Yeah.
I think that's just, these little bits of information that is starting to accumulate in the whole field, giving you a big picture of what this brain does. It's just, that's astonishing to me that these things become slowly possible.
Yeah. What about any AI related topic where you heard about it and you were like, this is really fascinating?
So there's lots of machine learning that is being used in neuroscience to analyze data. Just very, briefly said, to analyze data. You record neurons or you record fMRI, and it's highly complex, and you need to find patterns in it. Then this is one thing. The other thing is that we have talked very briefly about artificial neural networks, that they are not dynamical systems, they are just mathematical transformations. There's also this branch of AI neural networks research where you actually employ dynamical system neurons, so spiking neural networks, these biological neural networks. And they're also implemented nowadays in computers themselves. It's called neuromorphic computing, where you take this one or two equations I was trying to describe before and put it into silicon, and a bunch of transistor units then represent a neuron, and you can make a chip out of this, and you can simulate tens of thousands of neurons that don't obey classical computation cycles anymore, right? You don't have your whole architecture there, but it's basically a chip where you pump in data, and dynamics is evolving inside the chip, and it pumps out output. And you can use these technologies to, let's say, classify video data. So you can have a video camera and this chip plugged into it, and it can analyze the feed in real time without having to store it and load it to memory and do your machine learning thingies that you would usually do. So that's crazy that already these approaches are being kind of developed in technological sense. And then, of course, there is this question about, I'm building these brain models. My models don't understand. They don't learn. They don't represent information in a sense that you would, represent information in a data science or data way. But obviously, there is this goal or idea that you can, in principle, also start to build a brain from bottom up. So you start putting neurons in, connect them using connectivity that you learn from how a brain looks like, and then you come up with learning rules that are different from backpropagation and whatnot in the brain. Probably you had this conversation before. And then there is this idea that in principle it should be possible to build artificial intelligence using biological inspiration. And we're not even close to that. There are proof of concepts about that. And as I said, also learning algorithms and applications where it's already been used. But, the whole thing, of course, we're not close.
Mm-hmm. You talked about also machine learning or programming in general, which people can learn about, like neuroscience itself. And there's one framework called Neuralib, which is like for whole brain neural mass modeling, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Which they can use, but they can also look at your GitHub repo, if I'm not mistaken. You also have some notebooks which people can have a look at, right? In terms of that.
So the science is moving fast, I would say. So in the last couple of years, people are more aware that science needs to be easily reproducible. And IPython notebooks or notebooks in general, are an amazing way to deploy your science, kind of what you put into a paper, and make it available to the world such that they can reproduce your results. So I think, or Eric de Schutter is a famous computational neuroscientist. He recently, I heard him saying that if you publish a model today, but you don't publish the code, it's basically not science. I mean, or it's weak science, because if you can publish it, the code, the machinery, then you should. Problem with that is, though, that scientists are very often, very, very, very bad coders. Scientific coding it's almost a meme that scientists are very bad coders, because you usually don't. I mean, many people don't learn coding during their studies. I didn't learn coding during my studies. I learned it myself. So with that comes that you don't learn how to organize your code, how to make things, modular and refactor things from time to time, etc. You don't learn these things. That's why many scientists don't want to share their code. It's understandable, because, you spend so much time perfecting your paper, for example, and the code is usually left behind. So because of my PhD, we were building these software, Python tools to simulate networks and of neural masses of brain regions, what I was trying to describe before. And the whole code base just grew. And I know of some frameworks that allow you to do something similar. So I had the choice of basically using a pre-established framework or making it myself. And it just turned out that making it myself was the better idea, because it was much faster, much more hackable. It was much more how I was, and it was Python. And that whole project, which was growing organically for a couple of years, was not in a presentable form until a year ago or so. That's where I started, also with the help of some colleagues, to really put everything together and make a proper Python package out of it, which we now call Neuralib. And it helps other computational neuroscientists around the world. And I love to receive, random people writing me emails on how to use this or that because they've stumbled upon it. That's just beautiful, because we have just put everything together, put it on GitHub, and trying to care for it. And that software allows you to simulate your own brain, basically. So if you go to GitHub right now, you can clone the repository. There is some data which comes from brain scans. You can throw in all the models inside. There are a couple of models that you can choose, and then just press play, and something will start to bubble. And that whole brain simulation basically is the basis of what our research is based on.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to thank you and your colleagues for putting this together. I might have a look at it relatively soon. So thanks a lot. If people are interested in your path, because for me, it's very inspiring to see what you like, moving from physics to computational neuroscience. If they want to take the same path as you have done it, what advice would you give them? Like how to start programming, where to learn about computational neuroscience and all that kind of things?
I think programming is nowadays it's just not an option anymore. It's a definite must. Anyone who doesn't know programming yet, just start doing it. We're in a global pandemic right now. It's the best time to stay at home and learn these things. But also when the weather is there's no pandemic, you can still program. And when you start programming, I would advise everyone to, start with tutorials, but then start to come up with a project immediately, as fast as you can. Just have something that you actually want to reach and try to, if it's a game or a web scraper, or, it doesn't really matter. And it really doesn't have to do anything with the goal of your programming journey, right? You just have to start programming. And that's how you learn programming. And for anyone who is in the situation like I was, where you come from a very theoretical background, and then a new path opens up where you might have more realistic science, in a sense that neuroscience is actually about people at the end of the day. It turns out, and that was one of the biggest lessons I learned in this journey, is that science is so much more than just theoretical science. And it sounds very naive now when I say it or hear myself, but you can't even imagine, if you're a theoretical scientist, you can't even imagine how many problems will come when you just have a biological system. You need to extract it from somewhere, then you need to keep it alive, and you need to do it 20 times, and all of those samples must be comparable, and they only survive 3 hours, so you have to and then you record your data, and it's always shitty, and it's always noisy, and then you learn about these statistical methods to correct for your errors and to display data in a statistically significant, all these things. Turns out, and I believe nowadays, that they are central to science. Really, this makes a scientist at the end of the day. And I just learned that being a scientist is much, much more than being a theoretician. Being a scientist is a lot broader than I thought. And turns out you need all those things in order to become someone that has a wider view beyond what you just learned in school.
Yeah, this is excellent advice, Chala. I think you should also mention the two approaches existing, which is bottom-up and top-down approach. How do you approach problems? Is it like from first principles, or how do you personally do that?
That's a good question. So let me think. I think there is, we call ourselves computational neuroscientists, and the approach is very much bottom-up. And one opposite way, I would say, is maybe, and I don't want to, I'm not an expert in this. I hope I'm not saying anything stupid, but I think, for example, cognitive scientists, they start with a more top-down approach, where you look at specific function, for example, of the brain, and trying to model it in equations and systems. And so the difference, what is the difference between the two? As the name says, you have different points of where you start. In a bottom-up approach, I think you would start with, as you said, first principles. So what are my basic units that do this mechanism? In our case, it would be neurons. For a physicist, it could be particles, for example. And then what are the basic properties of these? The variables and parameters that are connected to these. And then only when you start putting those things together, you end up maybe with the phenomenon that you're actually trying to describe. So, for example, let's say I'm trying to describe how neural oscillations happen, right? The way I see it is a bottom-up approach would be, so, okay, how do I get a neural oscillation using neurons, right? Neurons they spike, they don't oscillate, they don't do this thing. It turns out then, if you plug in many of those together and you have excitatory and inhibitory ones, they can excite the inhibitory ones, and the inhibitory say, shut up to the excitatory ones, and then go down and they start doing this thing. Mm-hmm. And this looks a lot like an oscillation. So you end up with an oscillation. A top-down approach might be, maybe you're interested in how oscillations between two different brain areas they interfere with each other. So maybe you don't care about really the individual neurons, So you just say, okay, my oscillation is a sinusoidal wave. You just decouple yourself from the underlying neurons. You say, at the end of the day, I just want a wave. So you put a wave inside your system, and then you study how those waves interfere, for example. And that's how I see it, at least, how these two approaches are different. Ideally, when many people do science, some do bottom up, some do top down, then ideally you converge at some point. So I imagine it like a big mountain, and people start drilling holes in from two different locations, right? And in the best case, they actually meet in the middle somehow, so you don't have to go all the way as an individual. In neuroscience, we have big debates about what is a good approach and what not. I just want to mention, for example, the Human Brain Project, which is something very famous in our field. And it's a very, very big project. As if I'm not wrong, it's the biggest funded project ever in in Europe. So it's serious. And there, people are trying to simulate a very small piece of cortex, very, very small, cubic millimeter size in the scale, I guess. And they're trying to simulate this as realistically as possible. So they actually take brain, they slice brain slices, they image those slices, image all the neurons, they put them all together in a 3D model of neurons with neural networks. So it's extremely complicated. It's very much bottom up. They even simulate individual ion flows, like particles going in and out of the channels, right? But at the end, you end up with a very, very realistic simulation of a very small piece of cortex. Now, you might ask, what do you learn from this? What does it all, how does it help us? Some people say it doesn't help us that much because it's too, they have started way too low at the bottom. Others say it's very important because we haven't actually proven the most basic things yet. How does a calcium concentration around these neurons affect their firing and so on. So yeah, depends on who you ask, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Before we wrap things up, Caglar, one last thing. I saw in your paper where you talked about bifurcations. And I mean, physicists and engineers are very familiar with this terminology. Can you explain what it means for the brain, what a bifurcation is?
So bifurcation, what we call a bifurcation in physics is, so you have a process, and usually a nonlinear system, and it has lots of parameters. Let's say, you have the temperature of a gas, for example, again, a gas. And if you turn on the temperature, you slowly change this one of the parameters, the temperature of a gas. It might be, let's say, steam, it's water steam, and you turn it slowly down. If you reach a certain point at around 0 degrees for water, then a small change of a parameter can change the system drastically and very fast. That's called a bifurcation. So you change something very small and the effect is huge. It's not this chaos thing that many people associate with it, but it's close. So that's a bifurcation. And we use bifurcations in dynamical systems theory to describe how does a transition from one state to another state often look like. Right? And in the brain, what a bifurcation can be is, and if you imagine now a network model of the brain, so your brain areas are interconnected and they're all fizzing away, for example, asynchronously. Every brain area is a little bit doing their own thing, but they're communicating. So you can imagine that if you, for example, change one of the parameters, might be the coupling strength between brain areas. If you slowly turn it up, for example, that there's a certain threshold in which a small change can suddenly change the whole dynamics of the brain. So it might, for example, from this asynchronous state where all the brain areas were doing their own thing, suddenly transition into a state where all the brain areas synchronize and oscillate all together, completely changing the state of the brain on a macroscopic scale. And that would be a bifurcation. So this is one example of how bifurcation in the brain might be used to describe the transition, or might be even part of the brain itself, basically, if you look at it as a mathematical object.
Mm-hmm. super interesting. And of course, as I promised, I will put the link to your paper in the description so people can have a look at it. No matter if you're an engineer, computational neuroscientist, it doesn't really matter. It's really interesting to have a look at it. Also, I will link your Twitter profile because you're also, I would say, relatively active on Twitter, and any other links, for example, Neurolib, as well as your Jupyter notebooks that I've mentioned previously. Is there anything else you would like to tell the audience, Chala?
No, I don't think so. I mean, just stay healthy, stay happy, and try to learn as much as you can in this short and beautiful life.
Great. With that being said, thank you so much, Chala, for being my guest today. And if there's anything else coming out from you or your team, I would be happy to share it on social media with the rest of the audience so that they can keep up to date with your latest research projects. So thank you so much, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you as well. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.